Hello everyone, today we talk about the development of mercenarism between the 13th and the 14th century, a period that I already discussed in Schwerpunkt when it came especially to the I made a video about, for instance, the widening of late 13th century armor, the Ferrarese seal of the Guild of St. George. I think I discussed also something about 13th century chivalry. The title is 13th Century Chivalry Scattered Considerations, and also about maybe I narrowed it a bit down on kind of a national base when talking about English armies, recruitment in the 13th, 14th century, and in some other video like thoughts on chivalry, knighthood, and other related topics. So this is a also recently I made a medieval Western tactics video, medieval Western tactics 11th, 13th century an introduction. I'm naming all of these videos for the simple reason that I kind of, as many times I do at this point, given the number of the videos I've made, several videos that kind of get around a bit the point that I discuss eventually in other dedicated and kind of targeted videos. I don't know how to define them, because this is a very important moment of transition in European warfare. At the time, this I incidentally come to be close also in my interests to this phase in history, so I like to look at it in relative detail. And also, for instance, just yesterday I made a video on economical development of 13th century Europe. So many aspects that are related to, especially the end of this century, where the rise of mercenarism was becoming actually a thing, as we can say the standard organizational base of medieval warfare in the West, at least. This is important because, as I said before, there is this substantial abandonment of the ideal that war had to be essentially a matter of loyalty, of fealty, of something that how the feudal monarchies had began to develop in the previous centuries in order to strengthen their own their capability essentially of recruiting an army, so increasing the not just the centralization as such naturally was rather low still, but I mean the capability of, at this point cashing fast to hire mercenaries. This had been the real point. There were many events in 13th century warfare that make you understand, even at the beginning of the century, that the world was changing towards a certain direction. Think about Philip II of France and how he dealt with the English in the north, recruiting essentially mercenary armies and sending all the various French vassals in the south against the Albigensians, and therefore kind of getting rid of them, making them going to get themselves literally killed. We're thinking about Simon de Montfort and the siege of Toulouse, to essentially not to bother in the meanwhile. So promising, kind of making them bait at this actually pretty hefty prey of southern France, of the county of Toulouse and so on, but ultimately getting bogged down in there. And the ultimate winner were nor the Crusaders nor the Albigensians, but eventually the French monarchy in that case. And that's how these are also certain paths through which this phase of centralization was occurring. But as I was just discussing yesterday, one of the major characteristics of this period, of the transition of the 13th century, albeit being, if you want, the apex of feudalism, from an institutional, political, military point of view, even of predominance of the heavy cavalry on the battlefields, there were in parallel certain developments that were going essentially to unhinge, essentially to dismantle that model that was based mostly on this idea of natural resources, the idea that feudalism was something you had to work essentially in the base of, as we were saying, of loyalty, of fealty. So for apparent no reason, naturally, even before there were consistent economical interests, but the 13th century sees importantly the rise of trade, of financial economy. Europe basically has now gets for the first time a favorable balanced trade after many years over the East. The Europeans start accumulating and minting coins, gold, silver, golden coins on their own. There is the development of banking activities and so on. So one of the major consequences of this is that the market of war got increasingly more dynamic. Which meant that now the problem was not just holding the land. Naturally, it was still the base of the of medieval economy, and not just that one in history, but that there was essentially the opportunity of hiring, in spite of this feudal, beyond these feudal structures, and sometimes even in substitution in part of these feudal structures, soldiers to fight for you. Whoever you were, as long as you were rich, could be really anyone. Monarchy, princedom, duchy, city-state, everybody could basically start hiring these mercenaries. And this is very important because from one side, you see that the rise of mercenaries had always existed out there. You can't find, there's always been at all times in European history someone who was paid, even with actual money, not just with being rewarded with land or some natural good, that was hired for fighting. At the same time, at this point, however, you see that this process intensifies at the point that most armies were practically recruited in this fashion as mercenaries. On this side, in fact, on the other side, however, you see that the same feudal society was essentially part of the same thing, meaning that even feudal lords were at this point basically asking for their military service through money. It was only a very picky and punctilious meticulous organization of these expeditions, in the relation of the contribution of feudal retinues that were owed to the crown, for which that contingent could not serve for more than 12 days, that they only at a certain range within the border of the kingdom or in certain particular, and everything was basically negotiated, and it was starting being negotiated with money. And this naturally, we're not going to discuss this today, but this is an important background to see what was happening basically at that point, because even sovereigns at a point realized that not having a consistent strength over at least the high nobility, and they could, especially in certain kingdoms where this was more even, especially think about the kingdom of Germany, where the 13th century is basically the moment in which the monarchy gives up in many ways the idea of being able to create a national monarchy into Germany on the model that was happening in France. Instead, it was a highly successful model instead, and to look at other bases of sources of recruitment. So this in Germany it was particular because it was the class of the ministeriales that in many ways were kind of serve knights that at this point, however, were now it's a bit complicated to explain here. I'll do it another time. But let's say even in there, we find that there is a sort of mercenarism that is developing in the essentials. Even that's with the ministeriales is a bit way more complicated than that. It was also very strong territorial rooting, but aside from that, it was all mixed. Political. There was this economical management of war. As always, now it was done with these new means, these new financial means largely, and the problem was, in fact, this one. Everything could be both: imperial elections, armies, everything that was meant to make war happening. And this, in fact, generated also kind of strange, also political situations for which you could have a Spanish king that could be elected Holy Roman Emperor, as it happened even when that was contested. We're talking about Alfonso X of Castile, because everything could be bought and therefore nominally made functioning. Obviously, that was a pretty, let's say, particular moment of Holy Roman Imperial history, for which the same German nobility were searching for someone who, could not be so so strong in there, so to curb their own autonomy, so intrusive, let's say, so invasive in their affairs. Excuse me, I drink a little bit before we go on. But what I would like to discuss today in this picture is properly and really generally, and only from certain perspectives, because this is a huge topic and we can't cover it in only one video, how this transformation occurred substantially at a organizational level, or better, in the rise of this mercenary companies that up to that point had remained kind of, not an exception, but something definitely not prevalent, and now it was increasingly structuring itself and becoming kind of standard, even because of the same feudal lords, and now we're making a living out of it, because this is also the point, is that the same feudal lords who actually were rich in land and estates and so on were to essentially recruit private armies also through this system, and even selling their own services to this or that power that could finance them. And everything was much more dynamic than we think. I mean, you don't have to think of the political entity that is relatively strong and hires these guys and can dispose of them freely. This is basically neither the most realistic picture of the 15th century framing of the condotta system that was in fact being born at this time in embryo, let's say, at the end of the 13th century. But you have to think of a political system that was basically revolving around also the shift in the balance between these powers and what was on the market of war and who could be hired or not. So we're going to see today, first of all, let's make a point that is important also when you read the sources of this period to understand who's who in the armies, because a big problem that I'm facing right now, also for strictly, for my current duties, is you don't really know how, this is not a period that we have a huge documentation about. We start having this first kind of condotte contracts that tell us more or less how these mercenary companies were hired, but most of the times, especially in chronicles, in the news of those times, you don't really you're not really told who's who in terms of of the soldiers that are hired. Say there were 800 knights, and then you don't know, or better, 800. Well, okay, this is just a number; it's not important, but you're not told, for instance, how these troops were segmented. I mean, whether we're talking about cavalrymen, just heavy militas, and so on. Also, the terminology can vary a lot, because milis can mean sometimes not the knight, but the mere cavalrymen. You don't know whether these were mercenaries or whether these were recruited on a local conscriptional base, or because it was a private house, it was fine. So even in there, it's difficult to say, who's a mercenary, for instance, because especially if you have the same nobles that are paid to render their to provide their service with their retinues, the idea is, what's the difference between that of a mercenary? And the answer is evidently nothing. There is no difference in that sense, and there were still men fighting for war, like essentially most of the soldiers had been doing in all times in history. That I'm also quite, the stereotype, the prejudice that the mercenary is, somewhat more, let's say, less loyal than the local guy who is recruited to fight for his own land, theoretically, is a 19th century myth. In actual historical fact, especially at this time, this thing doesn't mean anything. Also because the local military organization was sometimes now also kind of declining in many ways. The 13th century is, interestingly enough, also a moment in which wealth basically generates this cultural detachment from the exercise of arms for great part of the population, and that's also why in parallel mercenarism practically increases, because if you become wealthy enough to afford someone who can go to die for you, you will most likely do it. Doesn't matter whether you're a burgher, a commoner who just thinks about his own shop, or whether you're actually a feudal lord yourself. Because at that point there is a conveniency that goes beyond, and there is also a kind of greater social stratification in many ways, for which, you know, maybe an 11th century knight could be a very humble person, could be relatively you know, wealthy, given that the war horse and panoply and so on is something enormously expensive. But paradoxically, you could have been given, well, at that time mercenarism existed as well, but let's say you might have also taken them from someone else in theory, and making a living in fact also as a mercenary at the time, and being this at this point society is kind of stratifying at a level in which also the cost of war is much higher. You know, a 13th century knight costed consistently more than an 11th century knight. It was still a huge expense for both times, but that's what I was trying to explain, especially in that video about the weighting of the 13th century armor, because that's something that entailed also progressive tactical segmentation of cavalry itself. That's where let's say even the tactical units of the lanks, this happened actually more in the 14th century, but at the last decades of the 13th century, you see that the essentials practically are already there. I mean, the idea that there is a heavy knight that is really the ultra heavy guy that fights, and then there is how do you say that, a squire that is that you read a squire, but you realize from the equipment of these contracts that basically had nothing to envy in terms of equipment to the heavy guy. Then there are this is also part of another process that is now explained poorly, but let's say that eventually in the 14th century these heavier units would be coupled with even other kind of light troops, like, I don't know, archers, horse archers, crossbowmen, and so on. So forming tactical units at that point that weren't just the cavalrymen as such, as kind of individuals hired in companies just for that, but, you know, essentially autonomous tactical units that were providing every kind of military specialization, but not for the sake of that particular specialization as a unit, but, you know, for the same unit. Means that these companies were kind of structuring as sort of armies on their own, with all the various tactical specialties that were useful mostly for them to survive in that turbulent times, in that extremely dynamic market of war. And of course there were certain companies that were kind of specialized on their own. There were even certain cities at this point that were selling their tactical, you know, their specialists. Think about the Genoese crossbowmen or other types of troops that were now famous for that very kind of warfare. Think about the Catalan troops that were thought to be, you know, they could be really actually a very every type of fighter, but they were usually conceived as light infantry. I mean, not conceived, they actually were, and also in there was a specialization in this sense. So also a dynamism that starts to happen at a, I can say at a doctrinal level, but which is a big word, kind of also anachronistic for the time, but really something that was dynamized. I don't know how to say that. Well, whatever. To kind of increase the synetical energy of this system, and therefore increasing also the differentiation of the system from a tactical point of view. This was another digression. I drink once again. And another phenomenon that characterizes this, nothing was really new. This is also important. There is not a moment where this thing kind of began. It's not at this time, at the end of the 13th century, this thing began. But it kind of starts to be more evident. It starts to be something way more structured than what had happened in the past. And another characteristic was the different geographical origin of these mercenaries. I mean, at this point, the European system was getting fully interconnected in many ways. It just takes to see how economy functioned at this time. Now Europe, the various European countries start to be economically dependent one from another, especially these monarchy, and especially for war. Think about all the loans that the English and the French monarchs contracted with these Lombard or Tuscan bankers, and how that eventually entailed the crisis of the 14th century. So there is also this chronicle shortage of money, this increase in also the increase of wars, because this is also what starts happening this time. Yesterday I was talking about that we see the 13th century as a moment of great rise, but it was not a progressive rise. It was also the intensification of wars, of famines, of kind of structural swings that could really destroy even an entire society in part. And in fact, with the big crisis of the mid 14th century, that's kind of very evident. Even though in that case, basically mercenarism was rather strengthened and not weakened. But one of the consequences of this phenomenon is that you could hire people from everywhere. I mean, the demand for troops at this point was such that people could come from literally everywhere in Europe and form these companies that in fact were quite multinational, if we want to use this term. And as we have seen, these troops were not just the desperados, let's say, that were joined just for the sake of war. There could be also people of a relative high social status that could go to fight in that way. There is, however, yes, a kind of even of a greater social mobility at this point, which is evident also at a broader level, not just in the armies, but in these mercenary companies, but in European society as a whole. This was the apex of feudalism as an age, but it was also a very strong rise of the commoners in many ways. So a person that there were so many people that came from a non-military environment that could start a business into warfare themselves. At this point, the armies of commoners start to grow in importance, definitely. They do structure themselves with a military organization, with new weapons. Think about the crossbow, and how this weapon is not really it's more revived than invented at the time, because I'm personally convinced that crossbows existed at all times, since ancient times to this period, but also in here we remember the rise of the crossbows. It was something new, because at this point it starts being used also en masse. And the crossbow, by the way, is a typical commoner weapon. The crossbow was considered the anti-chivalric weapon pro excellence at the time. Not that knights didn't use crossbows, because this is also a myth. Knights used every single type of weapon existing everywhere, including crossbows. Naturally, they didn't want to propagandate that too much, because also what we see of that world was very epiphenomenal, very celebrative, and idealistic in ways. But the crude reality of war was something that certain times kind of shows through our sources, meaning that yeah, we're told that this was the great century of the knights, of the tournaments, of the dames, of the ideal single, individual combat in duels and all this. But this was just literature that was emphasizing that cliche, because it was a time also in which there was a very strong literary development. There were it was a culture that was celebrating itself. But if you study battle after battle from the sources, you realize that there was much of that reality, of those cunning tactics and also weapons that were employed, that were we are to say, oh wow, this is, if we were to judge on the base of that idealism, we would say, well, this was so disloyal. But we historically, we don't actually know whether, how much this was actually and realistically perceived as such in real life. The ideals are one thing, reality is another, and that was a very prudent society in many ways. Of course, the chivalric world was much less romantic than we imagine, also in many other ways. This was a very sometimes also relatively promiscuous society. There were say that we have to look at many things we know about also how human society works and etc. before then just looking at the source and saying, okay, it was really like that, and we essentially believe what the mainstream at the time was for ideological reasons. Obviously, it was not. It was not back then, just like now. It's as if, at least this is how I interpret history, there is always a kind of a certain social dynamics that go on no matter what, and you can't stop. And this is particularly evident in warfare as well. I don't know why it reached this point, and neither if I had got to the one I started discussing. But, the rise of commoners also in these armies. Sometimes certain knights and aventuriers, we can say, people who basically made, in fact, a living out of war. Quite plain and simple. There is not many other ways to put it. Certain squires that rose to great prominence, to great importance, became generals, prized commanders, to royal armies. And there was also this idea that there was an increasing professionalization of the command. This is very important. Just yesterday I was reading certain Angevins, certain sources about the Angevin troops and you realize that, for instance, now the ruling classes, like the dynasties of monarchs and so on, now they were maintaining a very strong military status and function. In the 13th century, the king is still meant, and it will keep being like that for centuries, to fight in on the field, on the battlefield. But most of the times, these people could also not be particularly versed. So sometimes they were this representative person, was a royal blood and all this stuff, and then the actual commander, there was another guy, usually rising from the ranks, maybe noble, usually noble, because commanders were usually noblemen at this time, but even people who were basically entrusted the command of certain operations that, in this sense, according to their social status, could be also more or less dangerous, but that sometimes, in this sense, favored also the lesser, that could bring them to prove actually a greater ability in these situations of difficulty. War was extremely complicated also to move, to organize, to regulate. So sometimes, even in here, there is a distinction between the person who actually put up the army together and led it nominally and had to deal with the political situation locally and finding the resources, and then the guy who basically led it. And unfortunately, we're not extremely documented about, this. We are relatively well documented considering the times, especially in certain contexts in Europe. But we at the same time we don't have such a clear view of how all these relations were regulated. We're still probably something very fluid in many ways. So this is the point. When you look at all these knights that crowded the palaces of kings and princes as, essentially a military retinue as followers and so on, these weren't actually pure mercenaries. There was always this kind of intersection between politics and the military, also in terms of social status and so on, so of political connections and so on. As we were saying, it was a very more international context. I mean, knights, mercenaries traveled across Europe, at this time still relatively controlled. I mean, the moment at which this really gets out of hand is the 14th century, when you start having military companies that basically work as monads on their own, as if they were kind of political entities moving all over Europe, especially in these more fragmented or devastated areas. But that was a mess theoretically. If you look at France, Germany, and Italy during the 14th century, you have this total chaos in many ways. But other countries weren't faring that better, telling the truth. But this is the point. It's as if this thing developed in this myth grinder, where everything was being increasingly dynamic, and this started since a long time. I mean, also, I like to sometimes you're just less documented historically speaking. Therefore, you think that something wasn't happening until you don't see it. But there are many reasons to see that. Even in the previous centuries, during early medieval times, this was actually the norm. Now it was just accelerating, was just being intensified, nothing else. So mercenarism has always been international, and because it's based on practical reasons. If you find someone who fights well, you just hire him. That's it. And also, there are no national, being combativities that are one better than the other. There are certain, of course, political and social contexts that maybe provided the bulk of mercenaries. Usually mercenaries came from those areas where they were kind of wilder historically, because they were poorer, because in this sense it was also kind of a higher militarization of that particular society, so these guys were hired. And eventually these societies get gentrified, and they kind of undergo the same process. They start hiring mercenaries elsewhere. Then maybe this is not... we'll talk about it another time. Another very interesting form of this organization sometimes is, as we were saying before, also relatively to the problems of terminology in the sources, is that at this time there is a kind of equation of the knights and of the squires slash surgeons and other cavalry that existed out there. Up to a few. You think that the squire is stereotypically the guy who, kind of the serf, sometimes even unarmored, or relatively poorly armed, that follows the master, who is instead completely in full armor, and they are, the master is the true warrior, and that guy is just a helper. Well, at this time, this dichotomy has really vanished in great part, because of course squires properly and these field aides definitely existed. These armies at all times were full of civilians, or at least of people who maybe they were in service, but they weren't properly fighters. Sometimes to make mass. In the rare of formations, these were engaged into even during the battles and so on, but they weren't fighters proper. but the decrease in the organical, in the tactical unit organization, this kind of equation between the knight and the squire. Now, the reason why this happened, so that is the idea that the squire starts getting better armor. I mean, as well armored as the knight is. It obviously means that these weren't properly squires anymore. Just yesterday, I was reading this contract, one of the condotte from, I think it was from Wale, the army of the Florentine Republic, in which you see that. Oh no! Wait, sorry, this wasn't it. This was another thing. It was still about the same thing in the Angevin armies. Well, whatever. The idea that you were reading that. Now, there were, I think it was Florence that was asking the Angevins and Naples for certain troops. So this basically sent 100 knights, I think the term in the source is milites, now I don't remember, with golden spurs. Knights with golden spurs at this time, the golden spur was this kind of romantic and not so romantic idea that, that this was the cream of the chivalry in great part. They could wear these golden spurs, thinking about the Battle of Golden Spurs, Courtrai / Kortrijk in 1302, that this Flemish commoners basically take all the golden spurs they had stripped from the corpses of the French knights they had defeated in there, and brought them to the cathedral of, I think it was Bruges, or Brugge, I prefer, and they, because that equated basically to the cream, the high nobility, the elite of the elite. And in this contract you find that they wanted 100 knights with golden spurs, and then I think the term was, excuse me, maybe I can find it, 200 squires. This is the term you find. This was, let me check, because I'm writing this down in my thesis as well, so I was no, I should find now I put it down, but I didn't. Well, whatever. They were basically asked for. I should find it. Just wait, because this is from 1305. Let me check if there is a here. That you would think basically that the first guys were just the knights and the others were kind of squires, but let's search for spurs. No, I can't find it. Sorry. There is something wrong, but whatever. The thing is here is that you would think those 200 squires, because I'm sure that the term was squire. Say, well, okay, so these were simply 100 knights, 200 squires. So one knight and 2 squires. So you would think of them in this kind of field aid and so on. It said not, because in the contract you read that all of these knights, whether they were these cavalrymen, whether they were knights or squires, they had to have essentially spare horses for all of them, and they had to be equipped essentially for combat all at the same time. So this meant that if the knight already had his own spare horses, then usually had been historically the ones that it was the squire that brought to his master and so on. You realize, and the squire had certain horses on his own. You realize at that point that these were not properly squires. Scutiferi is the term, but it's something more. It's a guy that basically is a squire, but it's something more. Sometimes these were called domicile, I think, something like that, or donzelli, and these were essentially there was junior noblemen, really young men from the nobility that were sent to make apprenticeship essentially of war in the service of these other knights. So this means that these were theoretically still called for this kind of feudal elite fashion. These were ideally the squires of those men, okay? But as a matter of fact, they were noblemen themselves, and they were just fighting alongside the knight. So this means that naturally the knight with golden spur naturally was something greater. He was probably someone who had already an advanced experience in the heavier equipment and so on. So these guys were fighting alongside him as knights as well, but they all had their own squires that are not usually named, and probably were provided by someone else. Now this is could by themselves in part. This is naturally also very varied, and this was just an example of a contract in that situation, but you can argue that these conditions of employment really varied as the size of the companies really varied. At this time, the companies that were recruited were still relatively small things. You could find even up to 100, 200 companies of cavalrymen. It's not a few, actually, but these were really the big ones. Usually the company was 25, 50, 30, something like that, right around that, and or sometimes they could be hired even individually, and put together, because also organically speaking, you can imagine there was no standardization practically. The standardization in this time was mostly coming from the practice of warfare. In the time, in the sense, you can see that companies now were of this size because they were most kind of the size of certain squadrons, were organized as such. So there is also some functional reason for which they were in this number, and so on. But otherwise, these armies were quite heterogeneous in many ways, and you realize that most of them were even armies that were put together from many different, not just the soldiers came from different places, but actually the single contingents, the single units came from different communities practically, and they were put together, creating also problems that are kind of typical of medieval warfare, including the lack of unity of command. Sometimes where if you are this political fragmentation of Europe is reflected also in these matters. Armies were put together from many political entities, and they all had their own interest. It kind of they had put up an army. They evidently had a common interest in general, but naturally their opinion could differ. The commanders could quarrel, and all this stuff that sometimes also changed literally the history of Europe, because that battle was maybe had a different outcome because of this of these factors. And this is very important, and that's why also that you see that there is also the increasing need of having kind of capable commanders who are kind of specialized in this fashion, because it's in the 11th century when you find these monarchies that are still relatively small, and the situation is even more fragmented, you have the average knight is pretty these troops had just to stick together in smaller groups. The battles were smaller, and even the individual at that point could have a greater the individual fighter could have a greater impact in how things were going. At the end of the 13th century, beginning of the 14th, you realize that if you don't have a specialist of war that is also a skilled commander that masters the craft of war for a lifetime, you're going to have these military disasters, because, by the way, armies were getting bigger, they were getting increasingly costly, so there was evidently a demand for someone who knew how to handle this business professionally and knew how this war, and it was developing in a very spontaneous way through sheer practice, also because there was a lot of warfare going on. So this naturally favored the availability of such personnel, but everything could be also a matter of choosing the right commander, and command is a complicated thing. You don't have you don't know, you can't fully trust, and there are so many things that can go wrong, so it's even difficult for us to assess at this point in history the actual military capability of such commanders. It's not like, I don't know, in the 18th century or in Napoleonic times, where you have this rigidly framed statal military structure for which you have a commander at the top who is kind of in command of everything. It's everything much more depending on him and you have sources you can analyze in these huge armies, this hundreds of thousands and so on, that you can say, oh, well, that it was that guy's fault. In medieval times, when you have armies that rarely surpass the tens of thousands, you have all this fragmented command, it's basically impossible even to assess the actual capability of that single commander. I know that it's full of misconceptions relatively to how to judge a commander. There's plenty of people out there. Which was the best commander? You hear these lists that have really no sense whatsoever, mixing times, places, different societies, culture. It's important to get certain things right, and that's part of also the reason why the medieval warfare is neglected, because not because there weren't Hannibals or Napoleons in medieval times. It's simply that they weren't given the opportunity to put that military genius into practice. And however, there were certain excellent military commanders. At this point, we can spot, and that were also, and this was a world naturally also where the individual prowess was still something, really, also as warriors sometimes, because also in here the battles with tens of thousands were pretty rare. Most of warfare was this kind of pitched battles were also extremely rare. I mean, not extremely, but still, considering the average warfare. So many other operations were smaller. Incidentally, we're also less documented on these, but when were carried on by a certain particular character that was documented, was being praised because maybe it was a lord and so on, you realize that also from an individual point of view, that there was a need for being fit, strong, very I don't know how the term in English is, combative, something like that, or pugnacious, something like that. But this is not important now. So, however, what you find sometimes is that these squires, sergeants, and other stuff were sometimes mercenaries as well. What does this mean? It means that sometimes were certain noblemen who decided to commit themselves to this undertaking, like it's the case of the great Transalpine adventure of Charles of Anjou, the conquest of the Sicilian kingdom, and therefore the French conquest of southern Italy. And that was now the context is very, very fascinating. You know that Charles of Anjou was the brother of of Louis IX, King of France, Louis the Saint, and they were actually very different people, seemingly. They were these Capetians were this was the highest moment of chivalry and the ideals of knighthood and so on, and sometimes Louis and Charles are represented kind of the antithesis in many ways, because Louis IX is by tradition the saint, the great chivalrous lord, etc. Charles of Anjou was kind of the terrible fighter, the cunning and tricky and sneaky one, and ferocious and cold-blooded and disloyal. And this is a bit too forced, especially for Charles of Anjou, that after all wasn't such a bad. But he conquered basically the Sicilian kingdom at a point. Well, he actually won that one, but eventually Conradin of Swabia came into the south once again because he wanted to recover the legacy of the Hohenstaufen in the south, and Charles defeats him with a cunning tactics, with these tactics that were being developed in the west, perhaps by Eastern influence, but I'm not so convinced about it personally, because I studied closely these matters, and I think it was just a natural development of Western warfare. Basically, creating sort of an ambush, a sighted flank attack on the battlefield with a concealed force at the Battle of Tagliacozzo, and he defeated the Germans, who at that point actually had won the day. They weren't actually even properly Germans at that point. You find this mix. There were Germans, Spanish, Italians, and so on. And the French here, the Provençals, because actually also Charles of Anjou was Count of Provence, so he had seized this as a marriage land, and from there he started his Mediterranean adventure by doing this with a cruise and so. And he famously captured Conradin of Swabia, who was beheaded on the market square of Naples. Just I think the year afterwards, and so all people saying, but that for killing that guy, actually it was the Pope who forced the hand, because Charles of Anjou saw that also as a kind of a terrible thing to do at the time. Conradin was like only 16 years old, but he was the last male heir of the Hohenstaufen, and so the papacy now was also very pro-French side at the time. Preferred basically the Angevins to the Swabians eventually to repent of it, because it turned out the French were actually a greater pain in the ass than what the Swabians had been in there in the south. So there is also many different. It's a beautiful part of history telling, and I love it so much. It's actually my favorite one in the Middle Ages. But apart from this, I don't know where I was going with it. Oh yeah, saying that is an example of a campaign of several expeditions where there was an increase in mercenarism. Even the last Swabian armies in the south of Italy, like the one of Manfred of Hohenstaufen, but even partly the one of Frederick II, had been up to that point not German or Sicilian vassals. They were essentially mercenaries, largely German mercenaries, that were at this point, however, not they were functional obviously for that market and so on, but also their allegiance was so in that case, because the kingdom was in turmoil, not much because they were mercenaries proper, but I'd say there was also the national attachment at that point was not so strong anymore. There were other dynamics were happening, but also in the armies of Charles of Anjou, who was definitely a great politician and great military commander in his own way, you realize that the so-called squires, sergeants, and other knights who were following him at that point, aside from the bulk of his feudal elite, were all mercenaries. So I'm not entirely aware whether how frequent this really was, but it sounds like that many of these troops were naturally mercenary, but it would be interesting to know whether also the squires proper of these knights were. In my opinion, probably partly it's possible that you would hire a squire as such just because you found him, but also squires were usually men of trust, people who you really wanted to go to battle with, knowing that they depended on you, so that they were faithful, they could even die for you. This is a time, by the way, where loyalty is really a thing on battlefield. In fact, at the Battle of Tagliacozzo, there was this trick that Charles tended, because he also made his marshal, if I'm not wrong, or Siniscalc, I don't remember. There was an extremely faithful man, wear the coat of arms, the insignia of Charles of Anjou, and dying on the battlefield, thinking the Swabians that it was really Charles. And that's where the Swabians eventually lowered the guard when they defeated the first contingent. They start plundering all around the camp, and that's where Charles came out from with his concealed force from out of these tiny bushy valley, and caught the Imperial army at in open field, completely scattered, not lined up in formation, and captured and killed most of them. So for saying that, there was this still mixed allegiance in many ways. So maybe no, let's not insist on this because I don't know enough about whether these squires and sergeants were actually all, why they were called like that. Because at that point, even, why calling squire, sergeant a sergeant if it is not really that? I mean, if it is full of mercenaries that are objectively skilled fighters that are out there, and they're even freemen. I mean, there are people who do it for, like, why calling them squires of sergeants? In the case of that French army, you can't think that there was something mixed at this point. It's as if, because the French army really felt this feudal ideals. The French army was considered the most, actually, rightfully the strongest army in feudal Europe at the time. Now just the Germans were rising finally to match them, basically, in terms of individual military quality, at least. The idea is that they probably the French kept also this more insistently this vocabulary, stressing that there was a guy at the top. There was that elite that ruled. The French elites were the most elite of all Europe in this point. So calling these troops maybe squires or sergeants was still a way to recall that ancient feudal, kind of archaic at that point, feudal world where this segmentation was kind of more alive, but definitely was still alive in part, so it's not really... it would be interesting, however, considering these were mercenaries, to know whether that was just a title attached, or they were considered partly framed to that hierarchy, also in recruitment. I don't know how they were used eventually in relation with the real noble elite, but let's skip this. A big amount of information that we have from this time about these developments comes naturally from Italy. Italy, as we have said many times in Schwerpunkt at this time, was basically the most advanced country in Europe. They had the wealthiest guys. They had more money to spend. They were incredibly rich. They were financing, as a matter of fact, war also in other countries, and they especially recorded more. They were the most literate around. They produced more documents that were preserved, and this is the place where we start getting the first documents of the sort of proto condotte, proto indentures, proto these contracts of essentially hiring contracts of mercenary companies. We find it all around, and especially Florence is naturally being indeed the richest city in the world at the time, producing this amazing amount of material that, as far as I know, this is something I learned quite recently, telling the truth. Florence is still full of a huge amount of documentation that has still to be explored. Also military affairs, and it's such a complicated thing to do, because in order to search in those archives you have to be already extremely well acquainted how to do, and you have to know what you want to search. So paradoxically we have this huge amount of information, but it's very difficult to frame it, and to find someone who can actively study this thing. But let's say, just saying it because there might be someone out there who's interested in researching that field, and we could really know much more about this phenomenon in 13th century Europe by studying the Florentine archives. So also here, the Florentine case is particularly interesting for many reasons. If you want to read and to know more about that, probably the best work, or at least the starting point, should be Wale, the arm of the Florentine Republic. That is this very it scopes this very period, essentially the second half of the 13th and the first say the first decades of the 14th century. It's a very nice read. It's very, it has this Anglo-Saxon clarity and precision, so it's very interesting to read. And it lists basically these the documents that we have from here, and there is excuse me, a bit of background to understand really how the Florentine armies worked at this point. It wasn't much of a Florentine thing at this point, because we're talking about the 70s and the 80s of the 13th century. In this time, basically, there was a continuous, let's say, an ongoing warfare into Italy between these factions that are universally known as the Guelphs and the Ghibellines, that were originated initially from this German division between the House of Welfen in Bavaria, in Saxony, and Weiblingen was the war cry of the Swabian Hohenstaufen. And this had, however, basically defined the two major factions, respectively the pro-papal, pro-French side were the Guelphs, and the pro-imperial, pro-German side were the Ghibellines. Naturally, these are very fluid factions, and it's not really at this time. The thing was still pretty much alive, and there was an ongoing warfare at this point that was aimed at that point to basically annihilate the imperial power into Italy, or better, the German influence, because when Charles of Anjou had conquered the Kingdom of Naples, it had reached an enormous power that, coupled with one of the Kingdom of France, at this point had basically conquered both the north and the south of France, had kicked the English out, at least for up to that point, and it was this hegemonic system in Europe that was expanding also to be expanded into Hungary, later even to Poland. It was the French were ruling in Greece at this point as well. So there was this huge kind of empire that stretched from the Channel to the Aegean Sea that was French Angevin dominated. And Italy was in the middle, and the struggle up that point, the 4 centuries had been between not much the Germans and the French, but rather the Germans and the papacy. The papacy was tendentially more French oriented because of this reason, but let's say until the mid 13th century, basically the French didn't directly intervene into Italy as a presence. Now with Charles of Anjou, this big chunk of the Kingdom of Sicily, whose capital was Naples, by the way, at the time, was seized. Also, all the Sicilian grain was exported, and the way they basically managed this stuff is that the Angevins had entrusted had subcontracted, let's say, the monopoly of the Sicilian grain to the Tuscan bankers, because the Tuscan bankers were the ones who had financed the crusade against Manfred. So the papacy and the Angevins had drawn the money from these guys, mostly Florentines and Siennese, and therefore the most flourishing cities at that point. But that's the point, is that there was up to that point Tuscany had been relatively still fragmented had been actually tendentially pro-emperor in certain cases. For many reasons now it's difficult to explain, but now since the Florentines had got so tied and so interested into this Angevin affair in the south, they were now not just rocketing through the stars because of all the profits they gained from the subcontract of those activities, but now also actively fighting essentially for the Angevins into Italy against the Ghibelline presence. And this is a moment of great interest for the history of Florence, because basically it's the moment in which the Florentine people is also rising to power. Florence was essentially would grow to become essentially a sort of excuse me, I drink a little before I go on. Kind of a democratic government by standard. The idea that Florence basically remains a sort of republic by differently from the most of other Italian cities eventually that will pass to the lordship. And we're actively fighting now against this Ghibelline, so pro-German, pro-Imperial oriented communities into the rest of Tuscany, chiefly Arezzo, that was the kind of the neighbor of Florence. The warfare this time was kind of very intersected also in this it could be of an international scale as much of a local scale in many ways. I mean, the allegiances now influence directly the whole political in orientation. The local, Arezzo, for instance, was the usual enemy of the usual neighbor, Florence, that we're used to, but now they were also framed into this major siding, either with the papacy or the empire, would bear the French and the Germans, and they were benefiting from this respectively, naturally, because they received help from this or that power according to the situation. Florence was not alone at this point in Tuscany. They had managed basically to make Siena becoming Guelph, that had been traditionally Ghibelline, but after also certain dynamics had passed to also in there to the Guelph side. And there was an organization that was known as the I don't even know how to translate it properly, but it's in Latin. It's the Talia Militum Societatis Taliae Tusce, which basically is the Talia would be kind of a head money that basically was owed by these various. It was a sort of a league, basically. It was something similar to what had happened before. With the Lombard League, for instance, at the time of the clash with the Swabians and so on. But it was a bit different because this was practically based on the idea that this was an army of mercenary that the Tuscan cities were recruiting because of their wealth now. The wealth they were accumulating through the French connections. So there would be the head money of the knights and of the society of the head money of Tuscany. That would be literally in Latin. And this equated that basically every city was meant to provide this amount of troops. Sometimes there were also non-Tuscan cities participating to this, because there was this broader axis that now, so also other cities and other lords also participating to this activity. So this was a good occasion because the cities were essentially investing that money, and therefore there were lots of people that were interested to be hired as mercenaries. And in fact, in these years, I see that all these small, companies of knights that start joining from all over Italy and also consistently through this Talia from the 70s of the 13th century, that kind of remind eventually of the kind of prefigured in many ways the in Italy the condotte of the 14th century, because they were essentially the same thing. In fact, when we refer to the contracts hiring contracts of these units, we can't already talk about condotte proper, because the condotta usually is believed as highly regularized and framed military system of the 15th century. But this had an evolution. It wasn't the same thing. The essentials, these were mercenaries, but the way they could be organized was quite different. So the condotta is simply a mercenary. It's like the Indian tour you find in England or in any place. And this was the country where this was developing the most, simply because there was a higher availability of money. So there were more people that were hired from everywhere to come fighting, including lots of mercenaries. Also in here, during the clashes between the papacy and the empire, there had always been at this point kind of a either French or German knights that had been fighting this also in the previous centuries, and they were becoming, by the way, some of the basically the cream of these armies. Also for other of the Italian armies, communal armies, because these Italian communes were rising, especially in their popular component, especially in Tuscany. Tuscany hadn't had a very strong urban development up to the mid-13th century. It had been mostly Lombardy that had made it, and Lombardy had a much more stratified development because it was slower. What happens in Tuscany is that when the Angevins basically inject all this huge amount of money, or better, the Tuscans start making a freaking lot of money with the Neapolitan kingdom. All these classes of commoners, of bankers, of traders, of moneylenders that were involved into this business rose at the same time, very quickly, as a middle class. So incidentally, the communal infantries in Italy at this point were rising mostly. The infantries were essentially commoners at this point. So the Tuscan infantries were at this point rising as a very strong thing. It was actually a very sudden, consistent rise of their importance. In fact, the Florentines were basically the city where they had the armies, but this was more evident historically speaking. They had some of the biggest infantry armies of the time. Think about the Battle of Campaldino, of Montecatini, of Altopascio, and so on. So Florence was enormously wealthy, could field. It was one of the few cities that, for instance, could field so many troops to be able to besiege another city for a long time. And Italian cities were very hard to besiege. Not even imperial armies could basically manage to take them at one point. Florence was besieged in 1312 by the army of Henry VII, so that they couldn't make it through because these were rising to be enormously big things. It was different from the 12th century, where Barbarossa could basically take and storm Milan. It was still one of the greatest, basically the greatest city, the largest city at the time in Europe. Now things were getting extremely more complicated, also because of all this material wealth that was being accumulated. And in spite of the rise of infantries, now cavalry was kind of the most important element in the army. But the problem because now also this is very complicated to explain. I won't do it now. What was happening in Italy, what was happening to the rest of Europe, we will discuss it extensively in another video. But the point I wanted to make is that the rise of the commoners had brought to a temporary decline, let's say a political and social decline of the knightly class in the communes. The knightly class had been up to this point in the mid-13th century kind of the ruling class of communal Italy. They provided the bulk of the army in terms of strengths because they were the knights. So there could be even 10 commoners per one knight, but the knight was still kind of stronger. At this point, the commoners, especially within the cities, it's kind of an environment that also extremely advantageous for infantry, very uncomfortable for cavalry, because just imagine this medieval city streets and all what they were. You could bottle up quite easily knights. These commoners couldn't defeat the knights in open field proper. They could resist to them. The Italian infantry had managed to do it many times. They couldn't defeat them alone. They needed other knights to do it. But from the cities, they were able to to kick them out, because try to fight in a city street on horseback against thousands of troops with these pavis shields and crossbows and pikes that fight against you. It's kind of suicidal. So there is a bit of a paradox for which these communal cities kicked out part of their military elite, but now they needed that military elite because they needed the cavalry. So many of them, they did, you know what, we're so freaking wealthy, so let's hire mercenaries. And that's why in these armies you find historically so many Germans, so many French, because these were all troops that were coming now from those worlds of north of the Alps, where also many of these classes of knights were kind of declining, because the rise of monarchy and of stronger territorial lordships had kind of brought to the decline of certain military classes. For instance, in Germany there is at a certain point in the end of the 13th, the beginning of the 14th century, the crisis of the Ministeriales knights that greatly they reversed into Italy, because they were poor, and in Italy all these cities and lordships were paying them, were paying good for military service, were not going there. Taking these Germans were also kind of very good individual fighters. They had Germany is always this kind of Germany never properly had an eastern frontier, so there was sometimes this extremely there was a lot of warfare going on. If you look at the history of Germany, Bohemia, Poland, Hungary, at this point we're all fighting pretty intensely, and this had contributed also to the high military quality of these troops. The Italians at this point were doing kind of a different thing. So they had sometimes a very good military elite in terms of knights, especially those lords coming from the hinterland, the Apennines, that were kind of military families. In fact, were making a living out of this profession of arms now as military commanders, as generals, and so on. But there were too few. I mean, the big cities needed other troops, other knights, and these were the mercenary ones. So this Thalia Militum is very important, because it catalyzes also the hiring of all these troops into the peninsula, and this was mostly French dominated still, especially at this time. There were a lot of, in the Guelph armies in Italy, there were lots of French and Catalans at the same time. Then eventually also the Tuscans began to, there were mostly the Tuscans, they were mostly the Guelphs, so the situation starts hiring lots of Germans as well. By the way, also in the rest of Tuscany there were other powers like Pisa, or look at it, also hired consistent numbers of German mercenaries, because there were Ghibellines instead. So also there was a contact. You have to imagine that this system was all interconnected, for which the Ghibellines in Italy got troops from Germany, the Guelphs got troops from Naples, from Provence, from France, and so it really was. And there were other nationalities involved, chiefly the Catalans, as we've seen. And these companies were very multinational, in fact, as we've seen. There is an agreement that survives from 1277, this contract. Basically, it was Florence hiring the provincial commander Inghilese of Saint-Remy. And this guy had been in the service of Siena. By the way, so also sometimes it was difficult to understand where these guys came properly from, because Inghilese would mean basically Englishman, but it was from Saint-Remy and it was a provincial. So, but they could be quite multi-ethnical in many ways. After all, it was full of these guys, settling in other, these people settling in various parts of Europe, and being, they could be of mixed heritage, actually. And these guys were, you understand, already from this contracts and from the chronicles and so on, that they were kind of going from city to city just to live out of this business. I mean, it didn't happen episodically. It was like a system was already going on, that had been developing at least from the previous generations, and that probably, in my opinion, existed also from many times before. I mean, you find German mercenaries in Italy back in this. Think about the Battle of Civitate, the one between the papacy and the Normans. They were there since kind of ever in part. So at this time, by the way, the French were hiring also Italian mercenaries. Incredibly enough, commoners, because they might have hired knights. Instead, they were recruiting Italian infantry with pikes and stuff like that. In fact, after the Battle of Courtrai, Philip IV rushed for the hiring of this Lombard Tuscan mercenaries to fight against the Flemish infantries, because having probably they understood, even as they were French, so extremely keen on cavalry, so for evident reasons for which the French despised anyone who fought on foot. Essentially, they still understood that against this Flemish infantry, maybe it was good to use other infantry, and these Italian mercenaries kind of similarly behaved well against these Flemish troops, and that also speaks for the level of professionalism that even Italian infantry had reached up to that point. And also the decline of infantry in Italy during the 14th century is kind of a very important topic, because basically they had been on the lead in terms of infantry developments up to the previous centuries, and then eventually in the 14th they faded, and they didn't make it to participate to those great victories of commoners against feudal cavalry that characterized the early 14th century warfare in many other areas of Europe, like chiefly in Scotland, Switzerland, the Flanders chiefly, the 8th Martian, and also partly the English armies, but that's another story. Looking at this contract with Inglese of Saint-Remy, you see that the amount of knights, of cavalrymen actually hired were 100. These were paid 11 florins a month, and they were framed and they were using, beside the captain, also the together besides the captain, two banner, I don't know how to say it, the standard bearers. Basically, they had 2 other standard bearers. So this is kind of typical, considering the number of 100, because it's as if basically these were divided into 2 squadrons of 50. So they had the commander to standard bearers. So this makes us think it were 2 squadrons actually of a unit, and this is how units were usually sized. Actually, it's probably also larger than the average, but that's the point. There is a dynamization of warfare, maybe also entailed the participation of more troops. Maybe not all of them did the same thing on the battlefield. There were other kind of specialists and stuff like that. But it's still, this was quite a prestigious company, evidently. And in this contract, you find literally everything. The number, and the expense for their own scenes that had to bring to transport the supplies, the inspection of horses, the review, the inspection of the fighters, how disputes had to be basically resolved. Also, the fate of prisoners, the reciprocal guarantees in the indemnities in case of a anticipated resolution or the breaking of the contract. So all these activities also of insurance that naturally you can imagine how much these guys costed. So it was also pretty much an expense, especially Florentine. The Florentines weren't very happy spending money, and they always invested. They actually invested a lot in warfare, but much less in proportion than other cities, because they were extremely tight-fisted in there. They didn't want to. They wanted to expand the minimum for keeping the city afloat, and then maintaining their own capitals invested into other affairs, not war, mostly. And so another mercenary of this kind was William the Catalan. What we find is in service of Siena. There's another Guelph city at this point, from 1277 to 1285. So even very long contracts. This is very important. I mean, if someone was capable and the contract was profitable and convenient, these guys could remain hired for a very long time, or at least having subsequent contracts always with the same power, and was kind of normal. Then eventually these guys passed to Bologna. That is in Romagna, and this area is the city was also Guelph at the point, so it was also quite close to Florence. It's just across the Apennine, and it was very important because the Guelph connection between these two cities entailed, that the mountain passes in there were controlled, the trade routes were in the same hands of the same, let's say, political side, and this was also a very big city. Usually, this is not very important to tell. Then between 1288 and 89, William the Catalan passed in the service of Florence. Mistaken. In Bologna it was from 1288 to 1289, and then to Florence in 1290 to 1292. And we have a very interesting section of William the Catalan's troops, origin, where these guys were originary of. And we have 53 knights whose birthplace is kind of derivable from on the base of their name. So 28 of this came from Occitane. That is very widely meant. I mean, this area of today's southern France, essentially. 8 from northern France, and more specifically 6 from Picardy and 2 from the Flanders. 7 from Italy, 7 from the Iberian Peninsula, and only 3 of these were Catalans, which is kind of interesting, considering that the chief of this company was a Catalan himself, and just 1 cavalryman from England. So this is interesting because, for instance, here you see no German. So you can spot already from certain... Now, I'm just speculating, of course, but in part you can understand even what channels these troops were hired from. I mean, you see that these were mostly southern French, or people, however, gravitating from this area between... so that you find mostly also... They were coming from all the areas around: southern France, northern France, Iberian Peninsula, Italian Peninsula, and just 1 Englishman. What is interesting of this is that there was kind of seemingly no national affiliation. I mean, this is the phase, for instance, of the great Catalan mercenary company that went into Greece, into Turkey, kind of founded a state, or rule on its own. That is very famous because it's kind of iconic. It was very important. Think about the Battle of Cephissus, for instance, was one of the greatest victories of infantry over, in that case, the French feudal cavalry in Greece. So the Aragonese entered a bit into the Legion, into this, but most of the mercenary companies at this time weren't so I mean, I'm sure obviously also the Catalan company was quite mixed in origins of the participants, but that's still a bit of an exception of a kind of a multinational defined company. In fact, most of the times you realize that these companies, even when they were usually maybe prevalently from one nationality, they never kind of used, we are, I don't know, German company. Or because partly, first of all, they were mixed indeed, but at the same time, it was not the national base that really was a criterion at that point. These companies were, first of all, operating also together with many others at the same time. So even if this might have even stressed maybe some further divisions, the point here was based on economical convenience, known where you came from. Not where you came from. So, because it would be normal at the time, for instance, if you look at medieval universities, you find in every kind of corporation, also in trade and crafts and so on, there were many communities of foreigners everywhere, but this tended to be organized in foreign groups. For the military companies, it wasn't really like that. I mean, they tended obviously to be recruited usually on a national, some kind of base that was originary. There is also the problem now that at the beginning of the 14th century there are 3 Germanic expeditions into Italy from the north, from several kings, Henry VII, Kingdom of the Romans, then Ludwig the Bavarian, that also was elected eventually, and John of Bohemia, the one who died at Crécy, just for saying one. This injected a part, especially the Henry VII expedition, a consistent amount of German troops that maintained this kind of critical core, and also gave origin to certain companies like the Cerullo Company and other that were mostly German-based. So the Germans were now prominently figuring, especially from the beginning of the 14th century, into Italian armies. I mean, you can argue that most of these mercenaries were German in absolute terms. In fact, they were often called like that, even when they weren't, as a synecdoche, because they were prevalently that. Then eventually there is all the phase of the in the mid-century of the companies of soldiers of fortune and all this stuff that, and but we're not going to look at that because it's too far now. So there were different phases for which you start finding a certain point the White Company, that where these guys were remained unemployed from the 100 Years' War. Is mostly Englishmen and Frenchmen, but so there are kind of also these different national phases sometimes. But usually, however, the idea was that these troops came really from everywhere, and were so multinational in nature. So there is nothing to be impressed by. And the case of William the Catalan is interesting exactly for this reason. It was a Catalan, but actually of his 53 soldiers, only 7 were... Actually, only 3 were Catalan, and only 7 came from the Iberian Peninsula, so this is very meaningful. Yeah, this is kind of a... And there would be a lot to talk about. I already told you that if you're interested, you can go read Wale. That is kind of was one of the... There is some mistake in Wale every once in a while, but more than it's correct. I mean, it's sometimes just some source that is misquoted, but it's not a big deal. Structurally, it's still a very important text for studying the Florentine armies. But this was happening really in many places. Like, it would come to characterize. After all, the mercenary company is the base, basically, of every European army at this point, from the 14th century to wherever kind of a national, or better, centralized permanent professional army was created. And actually, that was a multinational business all the time. I mean, most of, I don't know, if you take even Frederick II's troops in the 18th century, you might think that those were all Germans. Obviously not. It was mostly an officer-involved thing. Many soldiers were French, were Italian, were Polish. So the idea of the multi-nationality of the troops at this point of the mercenaries is normal. It's just the average structural datum you can't basically, all the time see in this context. I don't know what else to add, because this was just a little part of the wall, but I thought I hoped that I gave you kind of the essentials of the story, and we can stop here. Naturally, we'll keep discussing about these topics in the future because they're rather interesting. And for now, I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.